We have a PhD in the classics.
Dr. Ian Silva.
So the classics is the study of antiquity.
We're talking about ancient Rome on manipulation games. That time is a crazy laboratory for manipulation.
Ancient political tradition was heavily dependent on your ability to express yourself eloquently.
Some things were working, some things were not working. And again, their fortunes would either rise or fall based on their ability to move the masses with their words.
Rhetoric was a formal discipline they would have studied. One of the most important things for them was memory. But it's a valuable lesson because you can't take things for granted, right? Things can easily slip away.
You're listening to Manipulation Games Psychology and Marketing Podcast with your hosts, Julian and Darren.
Welcome to Manipulation Games Psychology and Marketing Podcast. I'm Darren with our marketing expert and genius, Gene. How are you?
Hi.
We have a very special guest today.
Yes, we do.
We have a PhD in the classics. He recently graduated from Princeton.
Yes.
Ian.
Say
hi.
Our first PhD on the podcast.
Introduce yourself. Tell us who you are.
So, you did a pretty good job of it, summing up what I've been up to. I just finished at Princeton, and I studied the classics, and I've known Gene for many years.
We've been good friends for a long time.
And he somehow convinced me to join you.
Well, yeah,
Very happy to be here.
We got to formalize. It's Dr. Ian Silva.
Dr. Ian. Wow. How does that feel, being a doctor?
It feels, it's nice. It's nice. I put a lot of work into it, and it's nice to.
As you put your socks on in the morning, does it feel like different? Like, this is a doctor's feet.
Weighty feet.
Weighty feet.
Yeah.
Do girls walk up to you and be like, "Oh, hello, doctor,
No.
Dr. Ian"?
No. I
just remember I was listening to Adam Carolla's podcast. He was talking about Dr. Drew, because he was a doctor, and like elder gentleman, women would just be stalking him, just because he was a doctor. So so I'm just saying,
a silver fox.
Listen, maybe after this podcast, it'll happen.
Exactly.
Hey, it's put you on the map.
We're gonna get you out there, Ian. We're gonna get you out there, newly crowned doctor. All right. So you mentioned you're interested. You study the classics.
Yeah.
Please explain to the audience what that means. What it means to be studying the classics.
Yeah. So the classics is a sort of umbrella term for the study of antiquity, Greco-Roman antiquity, to be specific. It also extends to the Mediterranean world at large, Phoenicia and places like that. But mainly it's the study of Greco-Roman antiquity, and often, depending on, what sort of tract you follow, I followed the literary tract, so I had to learn Greek and Latin, these incredibly complex old languages, which nobody, reads or speaks anymore except me, although I don't speak it because that's crazy. So that's the gist of it, right? And it involves anything from the study of history to literature to philosophy, and it runs the gambit from before writing was even a thing, so very old archaeological inquiries down to the fall of Byzantium in the 15th century. So it's a very big.
It's a big topic.
Yeah.
The reason I think we're talking about ancient Rome on manipulation games
It's fascinating.
is today I think we're going to talk particularly about the fall of the Roman Republic, kind of the last stage before it becomes an empire, before Caesar basically takes over and makes it an empire. And that time is a crazy laboratory for manipulation, where people's fortunes and destinies would rise and fall with their ability to speak and their ability to convince and persuade the masses. And so there's a lot of really crazy characters in that time, and they're doing different things. Some things were working, some things were not working. And again, their fortunes would either rise or fall based on their ability to move the masses with their words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole ancient political tradition was heavily dependent on your ability to express yourself eloquently. You got to imagine, this was a time before, phones and televisions and distractions, and people, especially, well-educated elite Romans, which is largely, where the political action is taking place. These primarily men, they had world-class educations because they were born into wealth. They didn't have to worry about things. They had slaves. So they were taught from an early age how to speak well, in this case, in Latin. And rhetoric was a formal discipline that they would have studied, as soon as they learned to sort of like read literature. The sort of college level education for them was training in rhetoric.
So they're learning like from right off the bat, from the beginning, about how to argue, how to persuade.
Yeah, and even before the formal study of rhetoric, they would have learned Homer, and they would have learned Virgil. And the interesting thing about these epics is that you think of Homer, right? The Iliad, right? Talks about the war in Troy, one of the most famous wars in all of history. So you think that there's thousands and thousands of lines of poetry in this poem. It's an epic. So you'd think there'd be a fair amount of like battles, and there are, but 2/3 of this poem is just words exchanges between these Greek characters. It's rhetoric before rhetoric became even a formal study. So they're reading the stuff. They're learning how to essentially make arguments.
It's kind of interesting because now that I think about it, I feel like there needs to be more of that in our education system.
Oh, totally.
Right? Because we take English class and we learn how to write an essay, which is a kind of a form of argument, but I don't think there's very formal training in terms of learning how to speak in front of people.
Yeah.
I mean, because they put a huge emphasis learning how to speak in front of people and convince.
Yeah.
The art of manipulation, the art of influence. And in some ways that I think maybe we're actually letting down some of the people going through our school system because they're not learning how to essentially sell ideas, how to communicate powerfully.
Right. It's not, to my knowledge, a big priority in education. I mean, I'm sure you can take elective courses. You get to college, they do offer courses on rhetoric where you do sort of learn the more technical aspect of the art, and you probably read speeches, both ancient and modern, and learn how to like parse them. But largely that's elective, right? Nobody's telling you, hey, learn the art of persuasion, learn the art of speaking. And it is a sort of a disservice because it's incredibly important as a citizen of a free country where you have free speech to be able to, if you want to get ahead, make arguments and speeches yourself. But at the most basic level, to be able to deliberate, when you're witnessing debates in public, political debates, so on and so forth.
To be able to see what other people are saying, what kind of tricks and techniques they're using. I mean, we do have like debate teams and stuff like that, but people have to kind of step up and volunteer to be part of like debate teams.
I mean, I remember in high school, like that was part of the English class, and there was like one little tiny little debate, debate week or something.
Or you have things like, Toastmasters.
Toastmasters,
you can do, which is, I've heard it's very effective.
My dad went through that.
My dad
he
did
liked
too.
it a lot.
My
Yeah,
dad
liked
did
it a lot too.
We used to meet every couple of weeks at a Red Lobster.
Yeah, so people who know
give speeches.
Yeah, so people who know, they seek out this art form.
Yeah.
And again, in that late stage republic, as it's kind of approaching its fall, there's so much like soap opera fighting going on between these people, and they're using these techniques to essentially, again, try to rise up in power.
Right.
And I think a good place to potentially start would be Gaius Gracchus.
Yeah. Yeah, Gaius Gracchus was sort of a couple generations or a generation or so before the time period, which I imagine we'll spend more time talking about, the fall of the Republic. And just a little bit of the backstory as to what's going on in Rome at this time. Roman politics was incredibly competitive between a select few. So if you were a member of, let's call it the 20 or so elite families of Rome, you could expect to certainly make it into the Senate, if not the highest office in Rome, which was the consulship. Kind of like being president, but you had 2 consuls every year, and it was a 1-year term. So if you run the numbers on this, it was an incredibly hard position to get, even given the few families that were often competing, right? So you had that element of competition, and I would say for a good long while in Roman politics, politicians played nicely, right? They were competitive, but they knew when to step back. They exercised restraint.
There was a gentleman's agreement.
Right.
Interesting.
But the problem is that as the empire expanded, and I use that term empire loosely, it was still a republic at this time, but they started to expand. It started initially just in Rome, then it expanded to mainland Italy, then they got Sicily, and then they defeated the Carthaginians, and they had literally no enemies left. They called the Mediterranean Sea at that point Mare Nostrum, our sea.
Our sea. Okay.
So just to give you an idea of how like incredibly powerful this city-state was, and that's how it started. It was a city-state, right? The problem at that point is that you can't govern an empire with all of its problems with the sort of archaic systems of a small city-state. And this became increasingly apparent as time went on. So when you get to Gaius Gracchus and also his brother Tiberius, known as the Gracchi collectively, you had one of the biggest issues, which was simply an issue of economics. You had a lot of people who were very poor. They were in debt, and you had a land problem. Romans in the countryside, because at this point citizenship had been granted to all Italians, they simply had nowhere to live. So they were flooding the city of Rome because Rome at least had some handouts,
Free food,
exactly. So you had all of this concentrated, essentially, poverty in the city of Rome, and there was this question of what do we do about it? And Gaius Gracchus came up with a sort of bold solution, which was, why don't we distribute some land?
Okay.
Why don't we reform, how we deal with this land? Because at that point in time, a lot of this land was notionally public land, but it was truly held by the senators.
So he held some pretty kind of liberal ideas in terms of he was trying to basically help the poor, help to kind of do a redistribution. There's a massive inequality between the very powerful and
talk
kind
about
of the low
1%,
classes, right? But what I think was really fascinating when I've read about Gracchus is that he was so powerful a speaker. There's a certain moment in time they were just sending him, they try to keep him from coming back from like a military appointment just so he wouldn't be in Rome because he was so. They used the word, he was demonically powerful when he could speak. And because he could rise people up, right? And, we've previously talked about stage charisma, right? And how emotional contagion, when somebody can get into this like higher level of like a preacher type thing where he can move crowds. And Gaius Gracchus was somebody who was able to essentially almost basically stand up to the Senate. Because he was working with basically the masses and they were following him.
That's insane. So, because I'm just thinking, what kind of arguments would you have to make to give up land and distribute it to the poor away from the people who had the power? You must have been incredibly compelling in his arguments.
Yeah. Or, or not. You know,
Yeah.
if you have a sort of situation where you have a massive amount of people who are willing to hear what you have to say, you know, he would have to be very compelling to convince the Senate, but to gain the backing of the people of Rome, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Just talk to the masses.
he chose to talk to the masses.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly.
I remember I was reading at one point in time. Supposedly he did this thing where he pioneered the direction that he was facing when giving speeches away from the Senate to the mob.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So basically, he turned his back to the Senate.
Wow.
Like physically, like he's like, oh, I'm going to talk to the people instead.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It's truly, you know, a revolutionary guy. And just as a prelude to what we'll go on to talk about, I think is he pays for it with his life.
Right.
Yes.
Great.
Because the power of and again, largely this is tied to his ability to move people with words. You know, it was so great that the Senate feared what would come as a consequence. You know, it would force their hand essentially to give up the power and the possessions that they prized. So yeah, they organized and essentially got a mob together and stamped him out.
Yeah, and took him out.
And his brother too.
And well, yeah,
Wow.
and his brother died before him.
Yeah.
And I remember even there was this whole thing about how, like, one of the things he would do is to talk about how his brother would come to him in his dreams and tell him that it is his destiny to, you know, make these reforms happen.
Wow.
And so he was kind of, a lot of times when you read about the fall of the Republic, the first stories you hear about is the stories about the Gracchi brothers.
Yeah.
Because it sort of starts this thing where all of a sudden they're talking to the masses, and they're shifting masses to the point where the people who are the powers that be start losing grip, start losing control. And they eventually end up killing both Gracchi brothers.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like the first thing. And then people, a couple of generations after, or one generation after, are looking at these guys like, what were they doing?
Yeah.
Right.
They were like the original like disruptors, right?
Yeah.
They were totally messing with the balance of things as the Roman senators saw it, and they didn't like it, right? So yeah, the Gracchi.
The Gracchi.
Well,
Incredible.
I'm just thinking about like the whole like civilization at the time, where you know you could make such compelling arguments to like basically convince, you know, the whole direction of the empire, like which is a whole giant span of land.
Yeah.
By just talking, you know, and I was thinking, wow, that's really, really civilized kind of
Yeah.
society. It sounds really ideal, right?
Well, that's why it's a kind of a laboratory in the sense that they had this physical space, right? The forum,
The Forum.
which is this space in Rome where the entire purpose of this space is for people to gather and for arguments to be made and for votes to happen.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
And
trials to be
and
held.
trials to be
Okay.
held.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people who come to power in a lot of ways actually come to power during the trials
Yeah.
as people who are either making arguments for prosecution or for defense.
Yeah.
Which, so if you're talking about Gracchus as kind of the beginning of this kind of somebody rising up and kind of taking control, I think going now towards the Catiline affair
Yeah.
and the three characters in the Catiline affair.
Yeah. So the next, I guess, part of this story, another big name, figure dear to my heart is Marcus Tullius Cicero. And Cicero was a guy who was an outsider in terms of Roman politics. As I said before, you know, the leading families, a select, 20 or so families, sort of dominated the scene. Every year, their sons and grandsons were making it into the top offices. Cicero comes from outside of Rome, a little town called Arpinum, and his father makes the decision to move the family to Rome when he and his brother are young boys, and he gives them this first-class education. And Cicero, from the start, had an amazing ability even as a kid, as a public speaker. Caught on quick, and he eventually, gets trained by the top people and he becomes an advocate. He becomes a lawyer, right? And the way the legal system worked in Rome, I mean, especially with the top sort of senators, which were the most compelling trials, is, if you were a lawyer, generally it was bad form to prosecute. You had to have a lot of power behind you to prosecute someone else and say,
to go after somebody.
This guy did something bad, right?
Okay.
Because again, it was this sort of gentleman's game where like you didn't ask questions if someone was off, doing bad things in the provinces.
Well, a lot of people are being corrupt. And so the idea is like, if somebody goes after me, then
Exactly.
I'll go after you.
And that's kind of how the leading families operated. So Cicero, he's bopping around as a lawyer. He's taking cases, but he wants to get into politics. So he starts, at the bottom. Rome had this sort of sequence of offices leading up to the top one. So there's about 4 or 5 different like levels. So he starts at the bottom, and he serves in Sicily as a sort of like staff member. And when he comes back, he's ambitious. He wants to rise up, and it comes to his attention that there's this guy Verres who had served as governor of Sicily. And after his term in office, all these Sicilians start flooding into the city and trying to convince lawyers that like, hey, this guy was stealing from us. He was abusing his powers. He was essentially like extorting us while he's governor to like amass wealth and luxury.
Wow.
Nobody takes these guys seriously. So they come to Cicero, and he's like, sure, I'll take your case.
And Cicero's an outsider, right?
He's an outsider.
He's not in the noble families.
And at this point, he's still kind of a nobody.
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, I'll defend you.
And this is very taboo too.
Yeah,
to kind of do this.
Very taboo.
Yeah.
And Verres is the exact opposite. He's one of these wealthy dudes. So Cicero takes on the case, and he ends up prosecuting Verres, and Verres gets the leading orator in Rome at the time, this guy Hortensius, who nobody messed with. So it's kind of this like underdog match between Cicero and Hortensius. And long story short, Cicero so diligently like takes on the case, collects evidence. He goes to Sicily for a couple months, starts talking to everyone, getting facts, comes back with cases of notes and like documentation. And he prepares for like a mega trial. And he speaks one time in prosecution of Verres, and Verres realizes, oh my God.
What have I gotten myself
toast.
into?
I'm toast. So he gets out of town.
He runs
Oh
for it?
my gosh.
because these crimes were, if you got successfully prosecuted, it was a capital punishment. They didn't have an infrastructure to basically handle political malfeasance, right? So Verres basically self-exiles, just gets out of town. And this made Cicero a kind of celebrity. He was ultra famous in Rome after that because he took on one of the leading politicians and he won.
And so eventually this jettisons him into...
Yeah, this was Cicero's kind of like entry into the higher levels of politics.
And he becomes consul.
He becomes consul. So
basically president.
In 63, he becomes the equivalent of our president, right?
Wow.
It's kind of like if you watch C-SPAN and you watch like the hearings, it's like somebody doing so well in a hearing that it can jettison them into like a political career.
That's wild. Like you don't really see that nowadays, though. You don't. I mean,
People might not be. I mean, C-SPAN's always there. People might just not be paying attention.
I feel like a lot of people don't pay attention. Like having a forum. We have plenty of forums, but like to be able to move into power just by talking,
right? It kind of shows the level to which speech in the ancient world was super powerful. It's still powerful today, but in different ways, in different sort of arenas. So
the three characters kind of the Catiline affair. You have Cicero, right?
You have Cicero. So the Catiline affair is, you mentioned, this sort of thing with Verres catapults Cicero into political office. He reaches the highest office in 63, which is the consulship. Now, He ran for the consulship in 64. One of the guys he ran against was this guy, Catiline, who was a guy from an old revered Roman family, but one that had sort of like fallen on hard times, so to speak. But he still had his pedigree, right?
So they're poor, but they have the political.
Exactly, which is also the case with Julius Caesar, who we'll get to. But anyways, he runs unsuccessfully against Cicero, and he's pissed off about it because Cicero, this outsider, has attained the highest office, and he hasn't.
And this old political guy that doesn't.
Right. So Catiline is disgruntled. He's disaffected, and he starts making moves. He decides to run again in 63, whilst Cicero is consul for a second time, and he loses again.
Whoa. Nice, man.
So he's a two-time loser.
Yeah.
But he had made arrangements in that eventuality. He had this guy up in northern Italy kind of like assembling an army, and he had people in Rome who were conspiring to basically murder Cicero.
Oh, man.
Right?
Wow.
So he's doing like deep conspiratorial stuff, and Cicero catches wind of it because he also had his spies or whatever.
Okay.
And he catches wind of it. He again sort of like varies. He gets his evidence together, and he calls out Catiline, and in front of the senators, and he writes these 4 famous speeches called the Catilinarian speeches, in which he sort of discovers this, says Catiline's a dangerous dude. We got to do something about it. And same situation. Catiline gets out of town. He leaves. He goes up north to his buddy, who's there with an army, essentially. And he starts parading as consul. He takes the fasces, which were this sort of band of rods that symbolized the consular power. That's where we get the word fascism from, actually.
Oh,
yeah,
interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So he's doing that, but he's away from Rome. Meanwhile, Cicero needs to figure out what to do with the rest of the players,
The cronies.
the cronies of Catiline. And what happens now is sort of the next part of this story, in which essentially the Senate holds a debate about what to do with these guys. They have them in custody at this point, and they have to decide: do we kill them, or do we, punish them in some other way?
Oh.
And this was a very complex question in Rome, because generally, if you were a Roman citizen, which these sort of cronies were, you had massive amounts of protection. You couldn't be flogged, because the Romans like to whip people as a punishment. So if you were a Roman, there were laws in place that didn't allow you to be flogged
Or killed.
or murdered.
Yeah.
Right. Like without some kind of like trial.
Yeah.
So it's a high stakes situation, because Catiline is still at large, and he's got people in Rome. So they hold this debate, which is again why speeches were so powerful, is because every time the Senate made a decision, it was preceded by a sort of massive debate.
Like a fight. Yeah. Like in terms of arguments.
Yeah. And this is actually recorded by this historian, Gaius Gracchus, who writes the whole account of the Catilinarian Conspiracy. And at the culmination of his account, he talks about this debate, and 2 figures emerge as examples of either side of this question. The first one was Julius Caesar, who's sort of a young, hotshot politician at this point. He's not the Caesar we come to know.
Can I give some of the background on Caesar? Because this is fun.
Yeah.
So Dan Carlin does a great job on one of his podcasts talking about Caesar as a young man, because we think about Caesar as this like huge military leader, and he was, but when he was a young guy, he was kind of this hip, like, he was like, he basically is a hipster, is a dandy. He was famous for, essentially, he would wear these togas with these like super long flowy sleeves. He would like tweeze and shave. He was like this cool kid, like rich society kid, right? And there's a certain point in time, like he's described as his belt was never tightly fastened. And one of the big politicians of the time, he had this thing where he says, beware of the boy with the loose clothes.
It's like saggy pants now. It's like
Yeah,
a
yeah.
gangster, like a little laid back.
He would have lived in, like, if you were in New York, he would have lived in like Brooklyn or out here.
Yeah,
I don't know,
hipster.
maybe like Venice or something.
Yeah. And so he was like this like hot, young, hip guy, right? He was famous for sleeping with everybody's wives.
Oh my god!
Like
he was a player.
There's a certain
Oh
point in
my
time.
gosh.
Dan Carlin talks about this whole situation where there's this moment where Cato and Caesar are arguing in the Senate, and Cato is talking about how Caesar's part of a conspiracy. And at one point in time, somebody walks into the room and gives Caesar a note, and Cato's like, "Aha! This note is part of the conspiracy." And then Caesar like just hands him the note, and it's a sexy love letter from Cato's sister. And so, before Caesar became the big military commander, he was a very hip, charming, kind of society kid. He's almost like a Kardashian, but a Kardashian who's a military genius.
Yeah.
Wow, I had no idea.
And then the other person was in this Catiline affair was Cato.
Cato. Yeah. Marcus Porcius Cato, who was the exact opposite. Cato was a staunch Stoic. He had, he was a very principled man and stubborn. And there's accounts that he was, he was a bit of a prude, exactly the opposite.
He's like super moral, right?
Yeah, he wouldn't, kiss his wife in public, this kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay.
So these are the.
So, out of curiosity, so I get the difference between Caesar and Cato. What would be kind of like, how would Cicero stand in terms of like his style or his approach to, or his personality in this kind of
Cicero
battle?
Definitely would skew more Cato, but the frustrating thing about Cicero is that he wavered. He always wavered. He could never make up his mind about actions.
Okay.
He was an amazing speaker, and he had his moments of glory, but
wasn't decisive.
Was arguably not the best politician. Later on in this story, he undermines a very important figure, or not undermines, he underestimates a very important figure, which is the future Augustus. He thinks he's just a kid, and that he's gonna fall in line with what Cicero wants, but of course that wasn't the case. So Cicero's a bit, it's sad because he's such a brilliant man in so many ways, but he's also a very flawed man in others.
And so Caesar was more decisive than him, probably.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the Catiline affair, they're arguing about this.
So the moment reaches a crisis in the Senate, and they have to make a decision. And Caesar gives his speech, and it's a very typical speech of Caesar because later in life he became known for his clemency, right? He beats all these guys in the Civil War, and he pardons them, and that was something that you would be hard-pressed to find in ancient history, right? Generally, the victor, takes all the spoils, and
it's like tit for tat from the betrayal episode.
Yeah.
You win, but then you forgive eventually.
But I think Caesar at that point was so powerful that he could, he thought he could
get away with it
and pardon people. And I think there was a magnanimous part to his personality. So in this speech, he cautions, he advises caution with the Senate. He's like, let's not let our emotions cloud our judgment. Let's hold back. Let's, maybe exile these dudes.
So he's arguing that Senate should not execute these people part of this conspiracy.
Right. Right. And, it's a powerful speech. A lot of what ancient speeches did was, you would provide arguments based on, you'd figure out what the situation was. You'd maybe talk about the probabilities of certain outcomes. But a big part of it was marshaling what the Romans called exempla, which is where we get our word example from. Exempla were these sort of stories from the annals of Roman history, but also Greek history. So if you were an effective speaker, Cicero talks about this in his manuals for rhetoric. One of the most important things for them was memory. Not least of which because, if you wanted to speak effectively, you had to memorize your speech. And they had devices to do this, such as the memory palace, which is a really cool thing from the ancient world. But yes, so you had to have a memory to recall all of these different instances in Roman history and
Stories.
and Greek history, stories, so that when you were speaking in public, you could sort of marshal them to your argument. And
So they were arguing with stories.
with stories. And the important thing about these stories is that most of the time they were polyvalent or multivalent. You could argue them in such a way that it would fit your case, right? So an example would be, Aeneas. If you wanted to give an example of a true Roman hero, Aeneas was the founder of the Roman people. And he escapes Troy. He was a Trojan. Then he sort of comes to Italy. You talk about how Aeneas was so brave that he was able to rescue his family and the Trojans. After the Greeks sort of sacked the city of Troy and escape and live to fight another day. That's one way you could argue it. You could also argue that he was a coward, right?
Okay.
Because he literally didn't stay and fight.
Yeah.
Okay.
He fled. So you could bend these stories whichever way, and Romans often did this. So Caesar's speech is very cogent, very reasoned. He gives a couple of examples of clemency in the Greek historical tradition and the Roman tradition, and he kind of argues a very rational, in a very rational way. Cato again does the opposite, and it's something you wouldn't expect from Cato, because in other situations that we know about of his life, he was a very sort of cool-headed, rational dude. But he is so swept up in the dangers that could arise from this situation, not least of which because Catiline was also, he ran on a platform of debt cancellation, which the senators didn't like because they were the creditors.
So Cato was worried about these people because essentially they were traitors to the Republic.
They were traitors to the
And it
Republic.
could be dangerous if you let them live.
Yeah, and there was also this danger of things getting out of control for the senators if they were let to live, right? So Cato's approach in his speech is to cater to people's fears. There's only one example that Cato gives to back up his arguments in his speech. The rest of it is basically fear mongering. That if we let these guys live, even if we exile them, they're going to be more brazen in exile because we're not going to be around to watch them.
And they got away with it.
And they're going to get up to more things. Yeah. So and his argument wins the day, and they end up executing 4 or 5 of these Romans, which was arguably illegal. Right?
And potentially in the beginning of the end.
The beginning of the end. I mean, this comes back. So Cicero was kind of responsible for bringing this to light, and he as consul had the final say, and he decides, let's execute.
Wow.
This comes back to bite him in the butt.
So in terms of techniques that they were using to make their arguments, they tell stories, because stories are a good way of kind of framing
relevant
arguments,
stories.
Right? Relevant stories, right? And Cato, at least in this case, because he really wanted to convince people, he was tapping into emotion. He was tapping into fear. Yeah. And again, people make decisions based on emotions and then justify with logic after the fact.
I feel like this is so relevant now because it's this is a template, right? How to make an argument.
Well, exactly. I mean, and it gets back to what we were discussing earlier, that, because we don't really teach this stuff, I fear that, we're unprepared in a lot of situations to really.
Yeah, because up until a certain point in time, every gentleman of nobility, right, as part of their education, would learn this whole story, the whole story of the Roman Republic. Because again, as if you think about it as a laboratory where these different people were playing these manipulation games, some people were like giving tons of bread to the poor people to get their support. Some people were using speeches and fear mongering. A big part of getting elected, like a political ad in ancient Rome, was having gladiator battle and paying for entertainment.
Yeah.
So they always talk about how all power in Rome was it bread and circuses. So basically food, economic stuff, and entertainment, right?
Yeah.
And so people, the gentlemen, over time, aristocrats, oftentimes if you go to Oxford, 200 years ago, this is the stuff you'd be learning because there's this little laboratory.
Yeah.
In a period of about 500 years, they tried everything. They tried all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
Everything from trying to buy political influence to speaking your way to power to military prowess, different forms of government. And it's a really crazy laboratory to see how these different things played out.
Yeah. And the sort of founders of our system in the United States were steeped in this stuff. They really did think about all the implications of what happened in Greece, but especially in Rome, with their republican system.
Yeah, because again, America is a republic. I mean, we are a democracy, but primarily we're a republic.
Yeah.
And the aspects of being able to see how different people were using or abusing power in ancient Rome sort of helped, I guess, the founding fathers to be able to sort of look, okay, like we don't want that to happen. So what kind of check and balance can we put in place to keep things from kind of going awry?
They use the past history to their advantage.
To their advantage, to sculpt kind of the structure, again, of, if you think about a constitution as a rule, as a game with rules of how you play the game, how different actors can sort of interact. They were using this template of the old republic to figure out what went wrong.
All the examples, right? They had every example of everything that probably happened in society, and whether there was a positive or negative outcome that you can make an example of.
There's a letter of, I think it's Hamilton. He's thinking about leaving politics, and he decides to come back because his nemesis, Aaron Burr, was
the guy who shoots him, right?
Yeah. Aaron Burr was like, making moves to become president. And in this letter, he's like, I have to come back. I have to keep this Catiline from ruining the country.
Wow. So he actually named it
a Catiline. If I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
Anyways,
crazy.
so they were tossing these names about the founding fathers. Yeah. And so it's a very...
And what was interesting, I think, even about like the whole Catiline affair, is that almost every single person in the situation thought that they were trying to save the republic.
So
their method.
So who came out on top of this? It bite Cicero in the ass.
Yeah.
Who
So this ends up kind of coming back to bite him because he put Catiline or the conspirators to death. Later on in the story, a couple years down the road, people who were, sympathetic to Catiline and that sort of faction of Roman politics come to power, and Cicero ends up getting exiled by them. So he gets kicked out of Rome, and it's the saddest period of his life. Yeah.
Oh no.
So he gets kicked out of Rome.
Yeah.
Caesar grows in power because he becomes, he makes a name for himself.
Yeah.
Because people know, who's this young hot whippersnapper, and then eventually he goes and he starts a military career,
right?
Which also helps him like grow power. But a lot of the things that was happening is that people were witnessing how far you can get away with things. Because going back to the original, like we were talking about Gracchus, the guy who can like almost like demonically move people, he got away with stuff, right? And all of a sudden people are starting to notice, like, if you just talk really well, if you can really stir people up, you can get away with things.
Wow.
And so this is kind of what essentially led you want to talk about like, okay, what happened? Why did Caesar overthrow the Republic?
Well, I mean,
I know it's a big thing, but
it's a big thing. But the short and long of it is that he's in Gaul. Whenever you were consul, after you left office, you had the opportunity to go manage essentially one of the many Roman provinces.
Be a governor.
Be a governor. Cicero, when he gets out of office, he declines to do so because he just wants to hang out in Rome. He's too much of a busybody to like spend months outside. He doesn't see the advantage in that, whereas Caesar does. In his province, he takes sort of northern Italy, Cisalpine Gaul is what it was known as, and it's kind of shady what he does. You know, he takes advantage of the situation where, you know, he's on a frontier province because at that time, what's modern day France, what was known as Gaul back then, was tribes. It was not sort of under the fold of the Roman system. And Caesar kind of decides, well, you know, this is the perfect pretense for a war, and I can get glory, and I can do a massive service to the Roman people by sort of like...
So he manufactured a crisis?
He basically manufactured a crisis. And he spends the next, 5 or so years in Gaul, and he makes it so that the Senate keep renewing his contract, as it were, as general out there, because he had started this thing and he had to finish it, right? Otherwise, they would probably invade Italy. Mm-hmm. So he manufactures this crisis. He ends up conquering all of, France, parts of modern Belgium, and as a result of that, he's immensely wealthy, but he also has the power of his troops because they become sort of completely...
They're loyal. They fall in love with him.
They fall in love with him. They're dependent on him because he promises them, lavish payments in spoils, but also, in some cases, land rewards. So they love him. And the Senate at this time becomes increasingly jealous. And Pompey, his sometime friend, also, sort of becomes jealous of this guy who's kind of now overshadowing everything Pompey had done. Pompey had sort of conquered the east, parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. Yeah. So things come to a head.
Yeah. But the trend is essentially you start off with like Caesar, right? Who is just a person who's basically speaking in the Senate, right? He's arguing. He's part of the politics.
Right.
The verbal power, oration, the ability to convince becomes real power in terms of being assigned a military command, which then allows him to build the loyalty of these troops.
Right.
At the same time, it's other people are doing the same thing, right? So they're developing a deeper loyalty to themselves than they are to the idea of the Republic.
Exactly. So things come to a head, and basically it's Caesar against this sort of old guard Republic. And I think Caesar had his own vision for how things should happen politically. He probably viewed these senators as backwards looking. They were ultra conservative. They wanted to maintain the status quo. So that's what kind of precipitates this civil war, which ends up being fought between Caesar and the Senate led by Pompey.
So they put him in a situation where you either give up your army, or you give up your army and basically go to jail.
Yeah.
Or it's like, or I just go and overthrow them.
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't leave him much choice at that point then.
No.
Not really,
Yeah.
no.
I mean, his hands were tied for sure. He either faces prosecution or marches on Rome. So he marches on Rome.
And that's why they call it crossing the Rubicon.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's like going the point of no return, which is where it was the border, right, between where he was supposed to be and
Rome.
Rome.
It was basically this tiny little stream. You think of like a big river, but it actually wasn't. And this comes from Plutarch. Plutarch is amazing to read because you have all of these stories. He tells the lives of the famous Greeks and Romans, and in telling Caesar's story, he kind of makes a big deal of this moment where he passes beyond the boundary. So that ends up precipitating the Civil War, and Caesar comes out on top, right? And again, he's magnanimous. He pardons a lot of the people who fought against him because what he wanted at that point was a sort of working system. But the key thing there is that Caesar wanted a working system with himself at the top.
Okay.
And he wanted that to be manifest to everyone. And it was, once Caesar is triumphant, a lot of these senators, like Brutus, like Cassius, names that you might be familiar with from Shakespeare, they come back from the battle, they're pardoned, and they're sort of skulking about Rome. They're not happy because it's not business as usual. It's business with Caesar in charge. Caesar providing promotions and advancements.
Is he dictator for life already?
Basically.
So he elects himself dictator for life.
Yeah, he's granted it, but again, he's granted it because he has this immense army at his beck and call. So it becomes increasingly apparent once he's dictator for life that there's no going back. This guy's here to stay, and he flirts with kingship. There's this famous episode in Julius Caesar, which I think he gets from Plutarch, where Mark Antony at this big sort of public assembly offers Caesar the crown of a king, and Caesar kind of like pushes it away, and the crowd cheers. But then Mark Antony offers it again, and the crowd is like, no. So he kind of pushes it away. And then it becomes clear to Caesar that they don't want this, but he keeps pushing the boundary symbolically, about himself being the head honcho. And arguably, that's one of the reasons why they assassinate him, is because a king to the Roman people was complete anathema. Nobody wanted that.
This was kind of part of their culture for a long time, right? Where basically they didn't believe in.
Well, Rome
kings.
started as a monarchy.
Yeah.
And the guy who spearheads the assassination is this guy Brutus, and his ancestor was the guy who killed the last king of Rome, Tarquinius. So there's this kind of like full circle moment in Roman history with this guy Brutus.
How long did they make it from Tarquinius to?
Oh, a couple hundred years of the Republic.
The Republic was a couple hundred years?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
A long time. I mean, longer than I think the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the U.S. But it makes sense. I mean, there's a lot of parallels you could draw from today's society. Yeah. Like American is so built on the foundation of we the people, right?
Yeah.
And the democracy and the republic. Like we would not tolerate a dictator at all.
Well, it's interesting because that's kind of one of the things that was fascinating to me about the American Revolution, is that the American Revolution, if you really think about it, starts in the time of Robin Hood, right? Where during the time of Robin Hood, you have King John, and the barons basically forced King John, because he was taking all the money from everybody to fund the Richard of the Lionheart's wars. He's taking all the money from them to the point where it pushes the barons to basically revolt against King John and force him to sign a piece of paper, the Magna Carta, basically saying like, yeah, you could be king, but we get to vote on the taxes that you get to take from us, right? And that idea was already ingrained for 500 years before the American Revolution came, to the point where the Americans, right, they were here in the colonies, and they're like, "What, you taking all this money from us, but we didn't get to vote on the taxes."
Right.
And they were the fathers of the Revolution, were on the laps of their grandfathers who just had a English Revolution like 100 years before that. it's something that builds up over time, where there's a cultural understanding. I think it's probably one of the reasons why a lot of times we think about like, oh, bring democracy to a lot of places that don't have democracy, and then it doesn't really work. It's because there isn't as much of that. It takes time for it to become the norm for the culture of like, oh, this is fair. Oh, like corruption is bad. Like you don't get, the government can't just like kill people. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Without, or like put people in prison without a trial. Yeah. Like these norms have to kind of be baked in over time. And that's what makes a system robust.
Yeah. Yeah. This is definitely the case with the Romans, at least as the Roman historians thought of it. Because they really didn't have records going back all the way to the kings.
So Caesar did not know his audience. Yeah. When he basically decided he wanted to try to become dictator for life.
That's his big mistake, which kind of leads into the next part of the story, is that after Caesar's assassination, it was a careless plan because the assassins didn't really have a plan. A step 2. What happens after that? Step one, kill Caesar. Step 2, ? So things go awry, and you get another round of civil conflict, bloody civil conflict, I should say. But one of the things Caesar had done prior to his death is he named an heir, and his heir, an adoptive son, was this guy, the future emperor, Augustus. Mm-hmm. But at the time that Caesar was killed, he was a boy. He was 18. Mm-hmm. He was a kid. And he is out east, doing military training as you would do at that age. And, immediately his mother writes him and says, you got to stay put, don't come back because you've got a target on your back as Caesar's like heir. Caesar gives him money. He gives him his name. And so this boy, his name was Octavius. When he gets adopted by Caesar, he becomes Octavianus. So this is kind of a convenient, way for historians to refer to him. But when he gets adopted, from that point forward, he calls himself Caesar. He never calls himself Octavian. Historians refer to him that way because it's convenient. He calls himself Caesar. He comes back to Rome, and he basically claims what he believes is his right, his inheritance. And he starts trying to play a role in politics. And he comes up against Brutus. He comes up against Mark Antony. Mark Antony kind of naturally assumed that he would fill the role of Caesar. He never anticipated this kid.
In more ways than one.
Yeah.
When he hooks up with Cleopatra.
No, exactly. He really does take over the role, but he never expected this kid to come and like challenge him. And it's an amazing story because this brilliant guy,
18-year-old,
ends up on top of the whole system.
Wow.
And
what was he doing right?
Well, he had Caesar's name, which was
so he was able to leverage the symbol.
It was hugely important because the people, whatever the senators did, the people loved.
Is that like running for office as a Kennedy?
Sort of, yeah.
Or as a Roosevelt, like the ability to essentially leverage a previously known name.
Yeah, exactly. It's there. He uses it, and he has money, which helps. So
it rings so true today.
Yeah. But the other thing I should say is that initially, he's as he's kind of taking on Mark Antony and he's taking on the tyrannicides, the assassins. He's incredibly brutal. He has no problem killing political enemies. Wow. And that's sort of the backstory of his rise to power, is that it's very bloody.
Before that was normal though, right?
What?
Killing your political enemies.
It increasingly became normal as things started to deteriorate.
Right, because the gentleman's agreement started falling apart.
Yeah.
Going back to Cicero and him deciding to execute those conspirators.
Yeah. There were precedents. Yeah. Even before the conspirators, there were these nasty things called the prescriptions back in the time of Sulla. And essentially that was, Sulla was dictator for a brief moment. And in order to raise capital, he sort of published these lists of names, and he allowed anyone to go out and essentially assassinate these people to sort of take their estates.
And that's like one generation before all this stuff is happening.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's within recent memory. And, that was, but the thing about that is that, Sulla eventually, just he's satisfied with getting his political agenda through, and then that violence.
And he stepped down.
Stops. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyways, there's precedence for this sort of stuff, but it's amazing that this kid is able to, hold his own with guys like Mark Antony, who had a track record of being in politics and wielding armies. But I guess sort of the conclusion of the story is that Augustus Octavian eventually prevails. He and Antony eventually team up. They kill Brutus and Cassius and the guys who had put his father to death. And then Antony and Octavian fight it out, and Octavian wins.
Right. And the famous story is that Mark Antony and Cleopatra. They commit suicide in each other's arms with the snakes.
Yeah. Also in Plutarch, also in Shakespeare.
Okay.
So yeah, once there's no longer any enemies for Octavian to fight, he kind of has this choice. Like, what do I do with power? How do I represent it to the Roman people? Because it's more or less, I mean, in hindsight, you can sort of see it this way, that there was no longer any choice of going back to the Republic. A lot of senators probably would have thought there was, but there wasn't. So the brilliant thing about Octavian Augustus is that I think he learned from Caesar's mistake.
What did he do?
Which was, Caesar was too heavy-handed with his power, with his image, with its representation. Caesar had this kind of exotic wife to Roman eyes, not wife, but sort of mistress.
When he brought Cleopatra.
Yeah. I mean, that was a big mistake, because that's, to Romans, that was excess. That was foreign influence.
So he's rubbing people's faces.
He's rubbing people's faces.
In his power.
In his power, flirting with kingship. And arguably, that leads to his assassination. Octavian, does things a bit differently. He's a very smart dude. And he realizes that the only way he can sort of stay in power without having to, constantly look over his shoulder is by using the images that Romans were comfortable with, affecting a restoration of the Republic. So he comes back to Rome after all the wars, and he takes up the consulship himself with a partner. So he's not a single ruler. He sort of appoints a partner. And he holds it for a couple terms, right? Which was also not unusual in Roman history in certain cases. But eventually he steps down, right? And he takes a title, princeps, sort of the first citizen, not king, not monarch, princeps.
Sounds a lot like what Napoleon did.
Very simple.
Because Napoleon also made himself basically a first citizen.
Yeah.
At some point in time, before he eventually became emperor.
Yeah.
But it's like a transitionals. You got to ease them into it.
Exactly. Only Augustus never takes that title.
He never calls himself emperor.
Emperor. I mean, imperator, sure, but that the Roman word was more military.
Okay.
So he takes a simple title. He wields power, lightly.
Like behind the scenes?
Behind the scenes, in a way. But it's clear that he has the power, but he doesn't rub it in people's faces. He gives the consulship back to regular elections, but it's definitely a dictatorship. Just one that upholds the fiction of the Roman Republic.
The symbols, the totems.
Yeah.
So fascinating.
So
Yeah, because I feel like again there's so many parallels that we can learn from the past, and I think that's kind of the main theme of this podcast episode is what can we learn from previous precedents of history, of people gaining power and their fallacies, of politicians not getting murdered by just following these very simple things that these Romans did, right? I mean, it's like how to not get murdered.
Yeah.
Like don't be a bombastic, don't push people's boundaries, like listen to what the people, but you can still retain power.
But also it's the gentleman's agreement, right? It's maintaining the norms in society. So the idea is that you have the gentleman's agreement, then everybody become the best speakers you can be to make your arguments. You play the game within, again, their legal frameworks,
Right.
And you kind of keep it together that way, because otherwise you have to duke it out on like the field of battle.
Well, do you think we have a gentleman's agreement in this country?
Yeah, I think so.
Now?
I think so. Yeah.
But it's scary.
It is scary, but I there's been a lot of contentious times in American history, but I still think we maintain the gentleman's agreement, and we still vote, and we still have Congress, and they're at each other's throats. They're constantly arguing, but that's actually, when people get quiet, that's when I would actually start worrying.
Right. Yeah.
It's like the soap opera and the drama of the arguments. Like, we've solved a lot of the easy questions. The things we're arguing about now are the questions that don't have a clear answer, right? But we figured out a lot of things. We have very good answers to a lot of the ways we do things, about how we tax things, how we put money forth, that kind of thing. And so a lot of the things that we're arguing about are some of the more complicated questions.
Yeah.
And so we've definitely come far, I think, from the Roman Republic by learning from its lessons already.
Yeah. But it's a valuable lesson because, again, what you learn about looking at the Roman Republic is that, you can't take things for granted, right?
No.
Things can easily slip away. And I think part of the value, at least, of taking ancient rhetoric seriously as a subject is that it is, like Gene has pointed out, kind of like a laboratory of the power of speech. And you can go back, you can read this guy Sallust and look at how, a Caesar and a Cato shape an argument. Or Thucydides is another great example. Thucydides, most of his account of the Peloponnesian War is speeches for and against a decision to be made. And that's intensely valuable to anyone who would be an informed citizen, but also a powerful speaker.
Can you, I remember we touched base on this at one point in time, I think, talk about the calendar thing, which I think is very cool.
Oh, the calendar thing. Yeah. So Gene and I were talking about, the Roman Republic as one does, and about Caesar. And Gene was like, you should talk about the months. So
what's up with the months?
We have 2 months, right? We have July and August. And those names might sound familiar if you remember that.
Julius
Caesar is
Julius
and
his
Caesar.
son Augustus,
And Augustus. So originally, these months were termed, their names were Quintilis and Sextilis. So the 5th and the 6th month.
Okay.
Seems very logical.
Although the numbers kind of got skewed for other reasons, which is why December is actually the 12th month.
Even though it's Deca 10.
Yeah.
November is Nova 9.
So the numbers are
Octo
off.
is 8, but it's like 10th month. Yeah.
Never thought about that.
But one of the amazing things that Caesar is able to accomplish before he gets killed is he comes back to Rome from Egypt, where he's been sort of like talking to these astronomers and mathematicians, and he's like, we need to fix our calendar.
Okay.
Because the Roman calendar back then, before Caesar, was only 355 days long. It only accounted for 355 days.
Wow.
So rather than a leap day, you would have to insert leap months every so often.
Oh, okay.
Wow.
And the Romans were horrible at doing this because it was a political game for them. If you wanted to delay an election and you were on this committee that decided when the months were inserted, you'd simply not insert the month.
You could be president for an extra month.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
as a
this
consul, right?
This is part of the way that Caesar's able to stay in Gaul to fight, is because he has people back in Rome delaying the calendar so that they can't vote on whether he's to come back or not. Anyways, so he does this. He reforms the calendar. He's like, okay, let's insert, some more days so that the calendar year actually follows the solar year, right?
Okay.
So he inserts the proper number of days and he fixes the calendar, which is the Julian calendar, which we used up until the 1500s when it was reformed by Pope Gregory. So as a reward for doing this to himself, he changes the name of the month Quinctilis to Julius. And then Augustus later on, works some further reforms on the calendar, and he does the same thing.
He just inserts himself
That's
into
hilarious.
it.
And there was one emperor, I forget if it was Caligula or I forget which one, but one of the later emperors renamed all the months after all of his. He had like an incredible number of names for himself.
Okay.
And they all had to do with him.
With him.
Yeah.
Okay.
It only lasted.
So you just sneak it into the.
Yeah, it only lasted as long as he was in power. But yeah, that's how you get July and August.
Still to this day.
Yeah.
Man, what a legacy.
Yeah.
Those two
So
left.
I guess to kind of wrap up, let's do a quick review, I guess, of some of the things. And again, I'm always looking at these stories. I mean, these are really important stories that I think we should study even more in school. And you could do your own reading. There's the History of Rome by Mike Duncan, which is like one of the first podcasts. And then Dan Carlin, also Hardcore History, has a podcast about it, The Death Throes of the Old Republic. You can learn about it. But I'm looking at all of this stuff from the lens of the techniques, the manipulation games that are happening, right? And the things that really popped up to me for a lot of this stuff is, again, people like Gracchus, right? The emotional contagion, the stage charisma, where people can get very fiery, can get into this thing, and you could spread kind of emotion through people. And as we've sort of talked about in our episodes, kind of the neuroscience of decision making, people make decisions based on emotion, and then justify it with logic after the fact. And what was possible for some of these people is by leveraging this very emotionally powerful rhetoric, they could turn that into true power. Basically, they could go from being pathos, appeals to emotion, to eventually having authority, to ethos. Right. So verbal power can kind of become this kind of political power. And this is one of the main reasons I think people should study persuasion and speaking.
100%, absolutely. I mean, it just makes me really kind of makes me want to read a lot of these classic works.
Yeah.
So I could actually just learn from the past, because I feel like society, we've abandoned so many of these.
And it's also a thing that's relevant in so many different avenues. It's not just politics, it's boardrooms. It's any situation where, you have to marshal arguments and present them, and writing too,
Do you have a favorite rhetoric technique?
I don't do much public speaking. Shameful to say. But I will say this is a technique that's no longer used. It's gone out of fashion, but I will say I want to bring back the apostrophe, the direct address. One of the cool moves that Cicero makes in his first Catilinarian speech is traditionally, you would address the Senate, and you'd start out your speech by, the Romans called it captatio benevolentiae, garnering the good faith and the trust of your audience. So you'd speak to them, you'd speak to the senators, and sort of, get their goodwill, right? That's what was expected of this particular genre of speech. In the first Catilinarian, Cicero doesn't do this, sort of like you were talking about with Gracchus, where he sort of turns away from the senators and addresses the audience. Cicero famously addresses Catiline off the bat. The famous first words, quo usque tandem, Catiline, abutere patientia nostra. How much longer are you going to continue to wear down our patience? Because at this point, Catiline was just acting like nothing was happening, like it was business as usual. And Cicero calls him out. And it's a very powerful moment. So yeah.
I remember you also mentioned there's that other technique where I'm not saying this.
Yeah. This was another favorite Cicero trick where, he wanted to uphold maybe the decorum of a certain situation, and not mention something, distasteful or unpleasant. So he would say, I'm not going to say this. I'm not going to talk about how, Clodius's sister is a slut. I won't say it. That's not a nice thing to say.
I'm not going to say that you're incompetent.
Yeah, yeah.
That's below me to say that.
And this has come back in fashion with a certain American politician.
There's a lot of that stuff going on now.
He does it all the time.
Yeah.
But if you read Cicero's speeches, because they happened so long ago, we no longer have a stake in them. They're actually quite fun. He has a lot of fun tricks, so I would advise people to go
check it out. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Well, I loved it. Well, thank you, Dr. Ian.
Thank
Dr.
you guys.
Ian Silva.
It was it's nice to hear that.
Yeah.
Doctor. No, it was great to be on here, and I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, I feel like I just wanted to listen to everything that you had to say. I guess everything is just so fascinating.
Yeah,
I love the subject matter.
You can thank the Romans.
We will. We'll thank you, Romans.
Thank Caesar for
Caesar.
Graciously being assassinated.
Oh my God, life lessons.
Life lessons.
Anyways, thank you for joining us on Manipulation Game Psychology and Marketing Podcast. I hope you really enjoyed our guest, Dr. Ian, talking about the classics, and you should go read up on the classics as well. I will, as soon as I'm done with this podcast. I'm gonna start looking up some of the references, some books, and read some classics myself. So I'm Darren with our host, Gene. You can watch us on YouTube, or you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, bye.
Cheers.